Little girl was alone in the world. Hell's Angels Bikers intervention gave her a new beginning. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to our main character. The ride to Jack's garage was long, but it didn't feel like it. The wind had died down, and the night seemed to wrap them in a blanket of quiet, as if the world was holding its breath. The only sound was the rumble of Jack's Harley and the soft, steady breathing of the girl behind him. Her small arms clung to his waist, a silent plea for safety, for a place to belong. Jack could feel her slight trembling, not from the cold, but from fear. It wasn't just the chill of the night. It was something deeper, something Jack understood all too well. He kept his focus ahead, but his mind kept drifting back to the way her face had looked, so fragile, so alone. He hadn't asked her name, but it didn't matter. He knew that was coming. He had to get her somewhere safe first. His garage wasn't much, but it was all he had. The building had been a sanctuary of sorts, a place to fix bikes and forget everything else. But tonight, it would be something different. Tonight, it would be a refuge. When they arrived, Jack helped her off the bike carefully, making sure not to hurt her more than she already was. He didn't know the extent of her injuries yet, but he'd seen enough to know she'd been through more than a kid should ever have to endure. She looked up at him with wide eyes, still hesitant, still unsure. "You're safe now," he said, his voice quieter than usual, softer, like he was trying to convince himself as much as her. He led her into the garage, the dim light of the single bulb overhead casting long shadows on the cracked concrete floor. The place smelled of motor oil, old tires, and metal, but it was warm and it was quiet. That was all that mattered right now. He took off his jacket and hung it on a hook by the door before going over to the small couch in the corner. He motioned for her to sit, his movements deliberate, slow, trying not to startle her. She hesitated, but after a moment, she slid onto the couch, pulling the jacket tighter around her small frame. Jack didn't know where to start. He wasn't the type to comfort people, especially kids. Hell, he barely knew how to comfort himself. But something about her, something about the way she had looked at him, the trust she had placed in him without words, made him want to try. He crouched down in front of her, making sure not to tower over her, trying to make himself seem less intimidating. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice gentle. She looked up at him, her eyes still filled with uncertainty, but there was something else there now too, something like hope. "Emily," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Emily," Jack repeated, as if testing the name on his tongue. "All right, Emily. You're gonna be all right." He stood up and walked over to the small kitchen area. "You want something to eat?" he asked. Emily nodded, her eyes wide and a little bit hopeful. Jack rummaged through the fridge and found some leftovers, cold pizza, and a half-open jar of pickles. He didn't have much else. He placed the food in front of her, but she didn't move to eat it right away. She just stared at it, then looked up at him with those wide, trusting eyes. "You're not like the others," she said quietly. Jack froze. "What do you mean?" he asked, not sure he wanted to hear the answer. She bit her lip and shrugged. "They were mean. You're not mean." Jack looked down at her, his throat tightening. He had spent so much time being angry, hiding behind the walls he had built around himself. He hadn't even noticed how much that anger had shaped him. But Emily had seen something else. He had been taught to keep his distance from people, to not let anyone get too close. But with her sitting there, small and fragile, he felt a sense of responsibility he hadn't felt in years. Maybe ever. "I'm not gonna hurt you, Emily," he said quietly, his voice thick. "I'm here to help." Emily gave him a small smile, and for the first time since he had found her, Jack felt a shift inside. He wasn't just helping her. She was helping him too. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice soft. Jack didn't know how long they sat there, not speaking, just sharing the quiet. It was a new kind of silence for him, one that wasn't filled with regrets or anger. It was peaceful, and for the first time in a long time, Jack let himself enjoy it. Eventually, Emily finished the pizza, and Jack knew it was time to start taking care of her injuries. He helped her to her feet and guided her to the bathroom, where he checked her bruises and cuts. Her leg was badly scraped, and her wrist was swollen, but it wasn't anything life-threatening. He cleaned her up as best as he could, his hands surprisingly gentle despite their rough appearance. When they were done, Emily looked up at him, her eyes still filled with gratitude. "I don't have anywhere else to go," she said, her voice small but steady. Jack looked down at her, his heart aching. "You're safe here, Emily," he said, "for as long as you need." He didn't know what the future held for them, but at that moment, he knew he couldn't just walk away. He had a chance to do something right. And for the first time in a long time, he wanted to do it. He wanted to protect her. For the first time in years, Jack felt a flicker of hope. He wasn't alone anymore. Jack had spent the next few days adjusting to the fact that his life had changed. The garage, which had always been his solitary domain, now felt different. It wasn't just the girl, Emily, who had started to occupy space in his thoughts. It was the realization that he had been living in a shell, isolating himself from everything, hiding behind the tough exterior that the Hell's Angels had instilled in him. He'd told himself it was to protect others from the demons inside him, but the truth was, it was easier to shut everything out. Easier to keep writing, to keep moving. But now, with Emily here, with her small, innocent presence filling the quiet of the garage, Jack felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. Emily had started to open up about her life, telling Jack stories about her mother, about the life she had left behind, and about the days spent waiting for someone to help her. It was clear to Jack that Emily had learned to survive on her own. She was tough in a way that made him admire her. She didn't complain. She didn't ask for pity. She just existed. And it reminded Jack of himself. He had survived in a similar way, building walls around his heart, not letting anyone in. But now, with Emily, he had no choice. He had to let her in. One afternoon, as Jack worked on the motorcycle he had been restoring, Emily came over to him with a drawing she had made. She was holding it out to him, looking shy but eager for his approval. "Here," she said quietly, her voice soft but determined. Jack looked down at the paper, his heart tightening when he saw the picture. It was a simple drawing, just a little girl and a biker, riding together down an open road, the sun setting behind them. There was something about the image that hit him hard. It was the first time he had seen Emily truly express herself, and it made him realize how much she was starting to trust him. "I like it," Jack said, his voice gruff but filled with sincerity. "It's really good." Emily's face lit up with a small, shy smile. Jack felt something stir inside of him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. It was pride. He was proud of her, proud of how strong she was, and for the first time in years, Jack felt like he might actually be able to do something right. "You've got talent," he added, nodding at the picture. Emily beamed at the compliment, her eyes lighting up. "Thanks," she said, her voice small but full of gratitude. Jack found himself smiling back, something that hadn't come easily to him in a long time. They spent the rest of the afternoon together, Emily drawing and Jack working on his bike. It was a simple routine, but to Jack, it felt like the beginning of something new. The silence between them was comfortable now, filled with the unspoken understanding that they were both trying to heal, trying to find a way forward. That night, after dinner, Jack sat down at the small table in the corner of the garage. He stared at the wall for a while, the flickering light from the old bulb casting shadows around the room. Emily had already gone to bed, her soft breathing drifting through the room, and Jack found himself thinking about the future. He wasn't sure what it held, but for the first time in years, he didn't feel the need to run from it. He had someone to protect now, and that was enough to make him want to stay. The next day, Jack made a decision. He wasn't going to let Emily slip through his fingers. He wasn't going to make the same mistakes he had made before. He was going to be there for her, no matter what. He stood up, grabbed his jacket, and walked over to the door of the garage. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the parking lot outside. As Jack stepped outside, he felt a sense of purpose that had been absent from his life for far too long. He was going to be the protector, the one who kept her safe, just like the biker in her drawing. Jack wasn't sure what would come next, but for the first time in a long time, he felt ready for it. The days began to blend together as Jack fell into a new rhythm, one that felt both foreign and strangely familiar. The garage, once a place for mechanical work and solitude, had become a sanctuary, a place of quiet moments with Emily. Jack found himself spending more time with her, helping her with the small things, like teaching her how to fix things around the garage or simply talking about life. Emily, in turn, was becoming more and more comfortable around him. She wasn't afraid to laugh anymore, to show her personality, and it warmed Jack's heart in a way he hadn't expected. The once cold, hardened biker had found a new purpose, and it was a purpose he was beginning to care about more than anything else. One afternoon, while Jack was working on an engine, Emily came to him with something in her hand. It was another drawing. This time, it was a picture of the two of them, riding together down a long stretch of open road, the wind blowing through their hair. Jack smiled, a rare and genuine smile, as he looked at the picture. It wasn't just the drawing that struck him, though, it was the feeling behind it. Emily had begun to see him as a protector, as someone she could depend on, and that was something Jack hadn't felt in a long time. He carefully placed the drawing on the table in front of him and looked at her. "It's beautiful, Emily," he said, his voice soft. Emily's face lit up with a shy smile, and she nodded. "Thanks, Jack," she said quietly. I think we're going to be okay." Jack didn't know how to respond at first. The weight of her words hung in the air, and he realized that she was right. For the first time in a long time, he believed it too. They were going to be okay. But as much as Jack wanted to believe that things were starting to settle, he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something was still missing. There was a part of him, a part of his past, that he couldn't shake. It was a part that had shaped him, that had made him who he was, but also one that kept him distant from others. It was the part of him that he had tried to bury, the part that told him to keep riding, to keep moving, to never settle down. Jack didn't want to go back to that life. Not after everything he had been through, and not after meeting Emily. But there was still a pull, a voice in the back of his mind telling him that the past would always be there, waiting to catch up. That night, as Emily slept peacefully on the couch, Jack sat alone in the corner of the garage, staring at the drawing she had made. His mind wandered, and he found himself thinking about his past, about the choices he had made, and the things he had done to survive. He had lived a life of constant motion, never allowing himself to get too close to anyone. The Hells Angels had taught him that being alone was safer, that keeping people at a distance was the only way to protect them, and himself. But now, with Emily in his life, those old habits were beginning to feel like chains, holding him back from something better. Jack closed his eyes for a moment, letting the weight of his thoughts settle over him. He didn't know how to break free from his past, but he knew he had to try. For Emily's sake. He stood up and walked to the small window in the back of the garage, looking out at the darkened street beyond. The world seemed so quiet now, so still. He realized that the quiet was what he had been afraid of for so long. It was easier to live in the noise, in the chaos, but the quiet was where everything came into focus. And in that moment, Jack realized that he wasn't alone anymore. He didn't have to carry the weight of his past alone. He had Emily now. They had each other. The thought gave him a sense of peace, a sense of purpose that had been missing from his life for too long. As he stood there, watching the streetlights flicker in the distance, Jack knew that the road ahead was still uncertain. But for the first time in years, he felt ready to face it, to walk through it with Emily by his side. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he was no longer running from it. He had a new purpose now, and that purpose was to protect her, to give her the future she deserved. The past was behind him, and for the first time in a long time, Jack felt like he was heading toward something better. It had been a few weeks since Jack made his decision. The days had passed quietly, each one blending into the next, but things were different now. Emily had become a part of his life in a way that Jack hadn't expected. She was more than just someone he was protecting. She had become his anchor. The small moments they shared, whether it was fixing bikes together or simply sitting in silence, were moments Jack hadn't realized he needed. It was the kind of companionship he had long since given up on. He had always told himself that he was fine being alone. But now, with Emily around, he couldn't imagine life without her. Jack wasn't the kind of guy who could just sit still, but he found himself doing just that, spending evenings with Emily, letting the time pass in a way that felt natural, comfortable. They had created a routine, and Jack knew it was a good thing, even if it made him nervous. The past few years of his life had been about survival, constantly moving from one place to another, never staying in one spot too long. But Emily had changed all of that. One evening, after a long day of working on the bikes, Jack sat on the porch, watching the sun set over the horizon. Emily was inside, drawing again, her quiet presence filling the house. Jack had come to realize how much he enjoyed these small moments. Moments where the world slowed down and it was just the two of them. He wasn't used to this kind of peace. The noise of his past had always been louder, more demanding. But here, in this small corner of the world, things felt different. He had something to protect now, and that made him feel like maybe, just maybe, he had found a place to belong. The feeling was new to him. For so long, he had been driven by a need to escape. But with Emily, there was no need to run anymore. There was no need to keep moving. Jack realized that the feeling of safety, of having someone to care about, was something he had never really experienced. And now, with Emily by his side, he finally understood what it meant to have a home. But as much as he had come to embrace this new life, Jack couldn't forget the past. It lingered in the corners of his mind, like an old scar that never quite healed. He knew it wasn't going to be easy to completely move on. His past was something he had carried for years, a weight that had shaped him, defined him. But for the first time, he was beginning to see that it didn't have to define him anymore. He didn't have to be the person his past had tried to make him. Jack's thoughts were interrupted by Emily, who came out onto the porch and sat beside him, her small frame leaning against the railing. She looked up at him, her brown eyes soft, thoughtful. "Jack, do you think we'll ever be happy?" she asked, her voice quiet. Jack was taken aback by the question. It wasn't something he had expected. He had never really thought about happiness in the way Emily was asking. But as he looked at her, he realized something. He had spent so much of his life running, pushing everyone away, thinking that happiness wasn't meant for people like him. But now, with Emily there beside him, he wasn't so sure anymore. "I think we're already on our way," Jack said softly, looking out at the horizon. "You and me, we're already doing all right." Emily smiled, her eyes lighting up. Jack smiled back, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like maybe he had finally found what he was looking for. It wasn't about running anymore. It wasn't about keeping the past buried. It was about moving forward, together. And as the night settled in, with the stars beginning to twinkle in the sky, Jack realized that this, right here, was what he had been searching for all along. It had been a month since Jack had decided to stay. A month since he made the choice to stop running, to face the past and the future with Emily by his side. Things had started to feel more settled, but there was still a weight in Jack's chest that wouldn't quite go away. Every day, he found himself battling with the pull of his old life. His past wasn't something you could just forget, and it had a way of creeping up when you least expected it. Emily had become a light in his life, but Jack knew he wasn't done healing. One evening, as the last light of the day faded and the garage grew dark, Jack sat on the porch, the cool breeze running through his hair. Emily was inside, sketching again. She had taken to drawing, filling page after page with pictures of the world she wanted, one with freedom, adventure, and a future that was full of promise. Jack watched the sun dip below the horizon, the sky painted in shades of orange and purple. It was beautiful, but there was a sadness to it, something Jack couldn't shake. As much as he had changed in these weeks, his past had never fully let go. He wasn't sure if it ever would. He was pulled from his thoughts when he heard Emily's soft footsteps on the porch. She stepped outside, holding a drawing in her hands. Her smile was small, but warm as she approached him. "I made this for you," she said, holding the paper out to him. Jack looked at the drawing, and his heart squeezed in his chest. It was a picture of him, riding his Harley, with Emily beside him, her small hands holding tightly to his waist as they sped down an open road. The picture was filled with bright colors, the road stretching on forever, the sun shining down on them. It was everything Jack had ever wanted, even if he hadn't realized it until now. "It's perfect," Jack said, his voice thick with emotion. "You really think so?" Emily asked, her eyes wide, a little uncertain. Jack looked down at her, and for a moment, he couldn't speak. The weight of everything he had been through, the choices he had made, and the life he had lived, seemed to meld away in that moment. It was just him and her, and he knew, without a doubt, that he would do anything to keep her safe. "It's more than perfect," he said finally, his voice low. "It's exactly what I needed." Emily beamed, and Jack's chest tightened with something he hadn't felt in a long time: love. It was a quiet kind of love, a love that wasn't loud or filled with grand gestures, but it was real, and it was something he never thought he'd experience. He had spent so many years convincing himself that he didn't need anyone, that he didn't deserve anyone. But Emily had proven him wrong. She had shown him that there was still a place for him in this world, that he could still make a difference, that he could still protect someone and be loved in return. The sound of a motorcycle engine in the distance caught Jack's attention, and he glanced up at the road. He couldn't see anything yet, but the sound was getting closer. It was an unmistakable roar of a bike, a sound Jack had learned to recognize all too well. A few seconds later, he saw a black Harley cruising down the road, and his heart sank. He didn't need to see the rider's face to know who it was. It was one of his old brothers, someone from the club, and they had come looking for him. Jack's instinct was to stand up, to confront whoever it was. But as the bike slowed and stopped in front of the house, Jack stayed seated, his eyes locked on the figure who climbed off the bike. The man was tall, wearing the familiar black leather jacket with the Hells Angels patch on the back. Jack recognized him immediately. It was Reaper, a former club member who Jack had known all too well. Reaper looked down at Jack, his expression unreadable, before turning to look at the garage. "You're still here," Reaper said, his voice gruff. Jack didn't respond at first. He had spent years avoiding his old life, avoiding the men who had once been his family. But now, here they were, knocking on his door again. "I thought you'd be long gone by now," Reaper added, his tone colder than before. Jack stood up slowly, his hands tense at his sides. He wasn't sure what Reaper wanted, but he knew that he wasn't going back to the club. "Not now, not ever." "I'm not going anywhere," Jack said, his voice firm. "This is my life now." Reaper looked at him for a long moment, as if trying to read him. Then, with a shrug, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. "The boss wants to see you," Reaper said, holding it out to Jack. Jack hesitated, his gaze flickering to the paper, then back to Reaper. He didn't need to read it to know what it was. It was the invitation to return to the club, to pick up where he left off. But Jack knew better now. He had Emily, and he wasn't going to let anything or anyone take that away. "I'm not coming back," Jack said firmly, shaking his head. Reaper didn't seem surprised, but there was a flash of something in his eyes. Respect, maybe, or perhaps disappointment. "You'll regret it," he said quietly, turning back toward his bike. Jack didn't reply. He watched as Reaper got back on his bike, the engine roaring to life as he sped off into the distance. Jack stood there for a moment, the weight of the decision hanging in the air. He had made his choice. He wasn't going back. As he turned to walk back into the house, Emily came out onto the porch, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Who was that?" she asked. Jack looked at her, his heart swelling with pride. "Just someone from my past," he said softly. "But I'm here now, and I'm staying." Emily smiled, and Jack knew, deep down, that he had made the right choice. There was nothing in the world that mattered more than her. The past was gone, and the future was his to shape. The days following the visit from Reaper passed in a quiet, almost surreal way. Jack had expected more of a confrontation, a push to return to the life he had left behind. But instead, there was just silence. The kind of silence that settles into your bones and forces you to face things you'd rather ignore. It wasn't just the quiet of the garage or the lack of any more visitors. It was the quiet in Jack's mind, the quiet that reminded him he was no longer running, no longer hiding. Emily, for all her quiet strength, seemed to sense the shift. She was more withdrawn lately, her drawings less colorful, her smiles less frequent. Jack had no idea what she was thinking, but he knew that something had changed. Maybe it was the weight of the past, or maybe it was the realization that, despite everything, they were still both so alone. One evening, as Jack was working on his bike, Emily came into the garage. She was carrying a small box in her hands, her expression uncertain. "Jack," she said softly, her voice breaking the silence that had hung between them for days. "I found this." Jack paused, wiping his hands on a rag as he turned to face her. She held out the box, her eyes still filled with that same uncertainty. He took the box from her, his hands brushing hers for a moment, and opened it. Inside, there was a small photograph, yellowed with age. It was a picture of a younger Jack, standing next to a woman who had her arm around him. They were both smiling, the kind of carefree smile that only comes when you're young and haven't yet learned how to carry the weight of the world. Jack's heart clenched in his chest as he looked at the photo. "Where did you find this?" he asked, his voice tight. Emily shrugged, her gaze dropping to the floor. "I was looking through some old things in the attic. I thought it might be important." Jack didn't know what to. Once loved deeply, but who had walked away from him just like everyone else. The memories of their time together came rushing back, both the good and the bad. He had left her. He had pushed her away, just like he had done with everyone else in his life. But now, with Emily standing in front of him, Jack wondered if it had all been worth it. She was someone from my past, Jack said quietly, his fingers tracing the edges of the photo. Someone I thought I'd lost. Emily nodded, her gaze still focused on the floor. But you didn't lose her, did you? She asked, her voice soft but filled with a wisdom that caught Jack off guard. She's still a part of you, isn't she? Jack felt the weight of her words settle in his chest. He hadn't lost her. He had pushed her away, just like he had pushed away everyone else. And now, with Emily in his life, he realized that he couldn't keep running from his past. He couldn't keep pretending that everything was okay. I made mistakes, Jack said, his voice low. A lot of them. Emily looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. We all make mistakes, she said quietly. But that doesn't mean we can't make things right. Jack was silent for a long moment, the weight of her words sinking in. He had spent so many years running from his past, but now, with Emily by his side, he realized that he didn't have to run anymore. He could face the things he had done, the people he had hurt, and maybe, just maybe, he could start to heal. I don't know how to fix everything, Jack said finally, his voice thick with emotion. But I'm going to try. For you. For both of us. Emily smiled at him, a small but genuine smile that reached her eyes. I know you will, she said softly. I believe in you. Jack didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to face it. He wasn't alone anymore. He had Emily, and that was enough. They could face the future together, whatever it brought. And maybe, just maybe, they could start over. Start fresh. Jack looked out at the setting sun, the colors of the sky fading into darkness, and for the first time, he didn't feel afraid. He felt hope. A hope he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. The next few weeks unfolded with a sense of peace that Jack had never thought possible. The tension that had once filled the air like a heavy fog was gone, replaced by the gentle rhythm of everyday life. Emily seemed to be growing more comfortable in her new home, her laughter more frequent, her smile less hesitant. Jack had started to realize that he had begun to care for her more deeply than he had expected. He wanted to protect her, yes, but now he was starting to think of her as something more. She had become his family, in a way that no one else ever had. He had always been a lone wolf, content to ride solo, but Emily had cracked that armor wide open, and Jack wasn't sure he could ever go back to the way things were before. One morning, Jack woke up early, as he always did, to the sound of the birds outside and the soft light filtering through the small windows of the garage. He stretched and stood, making his way to the kitchen to start a pot of coffee. Emily had already been up for a while, sitting at the small table, her head buried in one of her drawing books. She looked up as Jack walked in, her eyes sparkling as she smiled. "Morning, Jack," she said, her voice soft but full of warmth. "Morning, Emily," he replied with a grin, grateful for the easy exchange. It was moments like this that made everything feel worth it. Jack poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down across from Emily, watching her as she carefully sketched something in her book. He had become so used to her presence that it was hard to remember what life had been like before she arrived. It was no longer just the sound of his bike roaring down the road or the hum of machines in the garage. Now, there was laughter. There were conversations, sometimes about silly things, sometimes about deeper thoughts that left Jack feeling like he was learning how to live again. "What are you working on?" Jack asked, breaking the silence. Emily looked up, her face lighting up as she showed him the drawing. It was a picture of a house, with a garden and a motorcycle parked outside. "I want a house like this," she said, her voice full of hope. "Somewhere we can stay forever, where nothing ever makes us leave." Jack's heart tightened at her words. He knew what she meant. She was searching for stability, for a place where she wouldn't have to keep running, a place where she could feel safe. "I think that sounds perfect," Jack said, trying to keep his voice steady. He didn't know if he could promise that kind of life, but he was willing to try. For her, he would try. As the weeks passed, things began to change. Jack found himself thinking less about his past and more about the future. He was still haunted by his old life, but the presence of Emily in his world made him want to be better. He began to make small improvements around the garage, fixing up the place to make it more comfortable, more like the home Emily deserved. He even found himself considering going back to school to finish the education he had abandoned all those years ago. It wasn't easy. There were days when the weight of his past felt like it was bearing down on him. But Emily was there, always reminding him that there was more to life than the mistakes he had made. One afternoon, as Jack was putting up a new shelf in the garage, Emily came to him with something in her hand. It was a small envelope, and she was holding it out to him, her eyes wide with curiosity. "This came for you," she said. Jack took the envelope from her, recognizing the handwriting on the front. His chest tightened as he opened it, and his fingers trembled as he read the words inside. It was a letter from the Hells Angels chapter, an invitation to return. The letter didn't surprise him. He had expected this moment to come eventually. What surprised him was how he felt as he read it. There was a time when he would have jumped at the chance to go back, to return to the world he had once been a part of. But now, with Emily beside him, that world seemed like a distant memory, one he had no intention of revisiting. Jack folded the letter carefully and set it down on the table. Emily watched him closely, her expression a mix of concern and hope. "What's it say?" she asked softly. Jack looked at her, his heart heavy. "It's from the old club," he said, his voice steady. "They want me to come back." Emily's face fell slightly, but she didn't say anything. She just waited for Jack to continue. He took a deep breath and looked at her. "But I'm not going back," he said, his voice firm. "I'm here. I'm staying here with you." Emily smiled, her eyes shining with relief and gratitude. "I knew you wouldn't leave," she whispered. Jack stood up and walked over to her, placing his hand on her shoulder. "You're my family now," he said quietly. "I'm not going anywhere." As they stood there, in the dim light of the garage, Jack realized that he had made the right choice. For the first time in years, he wasn't running. He had a future with Emily. And that was all that mattered. Jack woke up early that morning, the sun just beginning to peek over the horizon, casting a soft golden light across the quiet garage. It was a usual start for him, but today something felt different. He stood up slowly, stretching his back, feeling the weight of the day ahead. It was a Saturday, and while most people would spend their weekends relaxing, Jack had never really known how to relax. He had a routine that kept him moving, fixing bikes, repairing old machines, doing something that kept his hands busy. But today, something inside of him felt like it was calling for change. He walked over to the small kitchen area, making himself a cup of coffee, the aroma filling the garage. He could hear Emily in the next room, the soft sound of her pencil scratching against paper. She had become so much a part of his life that Jack couldn't remember the last time he had been this content, this settled. He found himself thinking about her more and more, not just as someone he was protecting, but as someone who had come to mean more than he ever anticipated. He took a sip of his coffee, staring out at the quiet street in front of him. It had been a few days since the letter from the Hells Angels had arrived, and the decision to turn his back on his past had settled in his bones. He was no longer part of that world. The past was over, and for the first time, he had a chance to build something real. As Jack took his coffee and walked back toward the living space, he found Emily sitting at the table, staring at her drawing, lost in her thoughts. She was different now, more confident, more comfortable. It was like she had found a new purpose, just like him. Jack couldn't help but smile as he leaned against the doorframe. "You always wake up early," he said, his voice soft. Emily looked up, a small smile playing on her lips. "I like the quiet," she replied, her voice gentle. "It feels peaceful." Jack nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. It was the kind of peace that neither of them had ever really known before. He sat down across from her, taking a moment to study her face. She was still young, but there was a maturity in her eyes that came from all the hardship she had faced. "What are you drawing today?" Jack asked, curious. Emily hesitated for a moment before turning the drawing toward him. It was a picture of a house, one that seemed warm and inviting, with a garden full of flowers. There were two figures standing in front of it, a man and a little girl, both smiling, the sun shining brightly overhead. It was the kind of picture that felt like hope. "I was thinking about what I want our future to look like," Emily said quietly, her voice almost as if she was speaking to herself. "A place where we don't have to worry about anything, where we can just be happy." Jack's chest tightened as he looked at the drawing. He saw the hope in her eyes, the dream of a life that was so far removed from the one they had both left behind. It was a dream he hadn't allowed himself to have in a long time. But now, with Emily by his side, he couldn't help but believe it was possible. He reached over and placed his hand on hers, his thumb brushing lightly across her skin. "I think that sounds perfect," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Emily smiled at him, her eyes lighting up in a way that made Jack's heart swell. "Do you think we can have it?" she asked her, voice full of hope. Jack took a deep breath and nodded. "Yeah, Emily, I think we can." There was a long silence between them, a silence that was filled with the weight of their shared understanding. Jack knew that life wouldn't be easy. He knew there would be challenges ahead, but for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to face them. He wasn't alone anymore. He had Emily, and together, they would build the life they both deserved. Over the next few days, Jack threw himself into making their small world even better. He fixed up the garage, adding small touches that made it feel more like a home. He even started saving money, putting aside enough for them to eventually find a place of their own. It wasn't going to happen overnight, but Jack was determined to make it work. Emily, too, had her own plans. She continued to draw, creating pictures of their future, each one filled with a little more detail than the last. Jack was amazed at how much she had grown in such a short time. She had gone from being a quiet, scared child to someone who could dream big, someone who could believe in a better future. A week later, they sat together on the porch, the evening sky painted with shades of pink and orange. Emily leaned against Jack, her head resting on his shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. They were both content in the quiet of the moment, knowing that for once, they had found something worth holding on to. As the stars began to appear in the night sky, Jack looked down at Emily, his heart full of promise. "We'll get there," he said softly, his voice full of certainty. Emily smiled up at him, her eyes sparkling. "I know," she said, and for the first time in his life, Jack truly believed it. Together, they would build the future they both deserved. The weeks that followed brought a sense of stability, but also a quiet undercurrent of change. Jack had settled into a rhythm with Emily, and the garage had become more than just a place of work. It was becoming their home, a sanctuary. Emily's drawings had started to fill the walls, each picture a testament to the dreams they were both starting to shape. The small, simple life they were building together was something Jack had never thought he would experience. There were moments of doubt, moments when the weight of his past felt heavier than he could bear, but he had learned to push those thoughts aside. Every day, Emily reminded him of why he had made this choice. Every laugh, every smile, every moment of quiet companionship was proof that the decision to leave the past behind was the right one. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. Jack woke up early one Saturday morning, the sun still low in the sky. He had gotten used to the early mornings, the silence before the world began to stir. It was his time to think, to plan, to reflect. He sat on the porch with a cup of coffee in hand, the warmth of the mug comforting him as the morning breeze gently ruffled his hair. Emily had already been up for a while, her soft footsteps a familiar sound as she moved around inside. Jack didn't mind the quiet anymore. It had become a part of his life, just as Emily had become. He had never known how to slow down, but with her, everything felt different. There was a sense of peace, of contentment, that he hadn't known was possible. The letter from the Hells Angels was still in the drawer, unopened, a reminder of the life he had walked away from. But Jack didn't need to open it. He knew what it said, and he knew what his answer would be. He wasn't going back. Not now, not ever. Emily had made sure of that. She was his reason for staying, for choosing something better. Jack had started to focus on the future. He had fixed up the garage as best he could, adding small touches that made it feel like a real home. He had started saving money, too, putting aside whatever he could, even if it wasn't much. It wasn't about the money, though. It was about building a life, about creating something solid that could stand the test of time. One day, as Jack worked on a bike, Emily came over to him with a smile on her face. "Jack, I was thinking," she began, her voice full of excitement. "What if we started looking for a place? A real house, somewhere we can stay for good?" Jack looked up from the bike, surprised by her words. He had been so focused on the present that he hadn't really thought about the future beyond the garage. But Emily's idea was exactly what he needed to hear. It was time. "I think that sounds perfect," Jack said, a smile tugging at his lips. "We'll start looking." Emily's eyes lit up, and Jack couldn't help but feel a surge of hope. They were taking another step forward, and it felt right. For the first time, Jack realized that he wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living, and he had Emily to thank for that. They spent the next few days looking at houses, driving around town, imagining what their future could look like. It wasn't easy, but it was fun. For the first time in a long time, Jack allowed himself to dream. They found a small house on the outskirts of town, not too far from the garage, but far enough to give them space. It was perfect for the two of them, simple, cozy, with a small garden in the back. Jack knew it wasn't going to be easy, but it was a step in the right direction. They were building something, together. As they sat on the porch of the house that would soon be theirs, Emily leaned against Jack, her head resting on his shoulder. "Do you think we'll be happy here?" she asked quietly, her voice full of hope. Jack looked down at her, his heart full of emotion. "I know we will," he said, his voice steady. "As long as we're together, we'll be okay." Emily smiled, and Jack felt a warmth spread through him. For the first time in years, he believed it. They had a future now, one that they could create for themselves. Jack didn't know what the future would bring, but he knew one thing for sure. He was no longer running. He had found something worth staying for, and he wasn't going to let it go. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Jack and Emily sat in the quiet of their new life, the promise of the future stretching out before them. They had come so far, and together, they would continue to move forward, hand in hand. The days passed quickly, and before Jack knew it, they had moved into their new home. The house, though small, felt like a fresh start. It was cozy, with just enough room for the two of them, and the small garden in the back already had the beginnings of a beautiful space where Emily could plant the flowers she loved. It was everything they needed, nothing extravagant, just simple and real. Jack had put in some time fixing up the place, painting the walls, making it feel like home. The garage, which had once been a place for mechanical work and solitude, was now a place where they both worked side by side. Emily had started helping Jack with small projects around the house. She was no longer just the little girl who needed protection. She was growing into someone who could contribute, who had her own dreams and ideas. It filled Jack with pride to see her come out of her shell, to see her start to believe that she could have a life worth living. One evening, after a long day of work, Jack sat on the porch with a cold beer in hand, watching the sunset. Emily was inside, reading one of the books Jack had bought for her, but she would join him soon enough. She always did. The house was quiet, save for the sounds of crickets in the yard and the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. It was peaceful, but Jack could feel the weight of the world still hanging on his shoulders. He had come so far, but he wasn't sure if he was truly free from his past. The Hells Angels were still a part of him, a part of his history that he couldn't just erase. But now, sitting there, watching the sky change colors, Jack realized something. He had done the hardest part. He had made a choice. He had chosen to stay, to build something different, something better. He wasn't just existing anymore. He was living, and that was enough. A soft thud of footsteps on the porch steps brought Jack back to the present, and he looked up to see Emily standing there, a small smile on her face. "It's nice out here," she said, settling down beside him. "Yeah, it is," Jack replied, taking a sip from his beer. They sat in silence for a moment, both of them looking out at the horizon. The night was falling, the stars beginning to twinkle in the sky. For a moment, Jack let himself just be. There was no noise, no distractions, just the quiet of the world around them. He had spent so many years trying to outrun his past, but now, here with Emily, he felt like he had finally caught up. "I think we made the right choice," Emily said quietly, breaking the silence. Jack turned to look at her, surprised by her words. "What do you mean?" he asked. Emily shrugged, her smile softening. "I mean this. Us. The house. I think this is what we were supposed to have all along." Jack felt his heart swell with emotion. She was right. This was what he had been searching for, without even knowing it. He had spent so much of his life running from something, from the mistakes he had made, but now, with Emily beside him, he knew he had found something worth staying for. "I think you're right," Jack said, his voice thick with feeling. "We're building something here. Something real." Emily nodded, her eyes sparkling with understanding. "I'm glad we found it," she said softly. Jack smiled, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid. He had found his place, and he had found it with Emily. As the stars continued to fill the sky, Jack leaned back in his chair, the weight of the past lifting just a little more. He was home. They were home. And that was all that mattered. Jack and Emily spent the next few months settling into their new life, each day feeling more like a step towards something real. The house, though small, was starting to feel like home. Jack had continued his work on the bikes, and Emily spent more and more time drawing, capturing the world she dreamed of with every sketch. It was clear to Jack that her confidence was growing, and the girl who had once been scared and uncertain was now blossoming into a young woman with ideas and hopes for the future. The quiet of their life was a welcome change, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. The letter from the Hells Angels was still in his drawer, but he had learned to ignore it. Every now and then, he would catch a glimpse of it and feel that familiar tug, that pull from the past that he had tried so hard to outrun. But Emily was the reason he had stayed. She was his future, and he wouldn't let anything threaten that. Still, the past had a way of resurfacing, and Jack couldn't deny the fact that his old life was never far from his thoughts. One afternoon, as Jack was working on the engine of a motorcycle, he heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. His heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, he thought it might be someone from his past. But when he looked up, he saw a familiar face walking toward the garage. It was Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman who lived next door. Jack had gotten to know her over the past few months, and she had become a sort of surrogate grandmother to Emily, always bringing over baked goods and chatting about the town's history. "Jack," she called out with a warm smile. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Jack wiped his hands on a rag and smiled back at her. "Not at all, Mrs. Henderson. What brings you by?" Mrs. Henderson walked up to the door, holding a small package in her hands. "I just wanted to bring you something," she said, handing it over. "It's from my late husband's collection. I thought you might appreciate it." Jack took the package and carefully unwrapped it. Inside, he found a small, weathered book. The cover was old, and the pages had yellowed with time, but the title caught his attention, The Road Ahead. It was a book about motorcycle repair and maintenance, something Jack had read countless times during his years as a mechanic. "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson," Jack said, his voice thick with gratitude. "This means a lot to me." She smiled at him, her eyes soft with understanding. "I thought it might," she said. "My husband always said that the road ahead is never as clear as we want it to be, but it's the journey that matters, not the destination." Jack nodded, the words resonating with him more than he expected. The road ahead had never been clear for him, but it was starting to feel like he had a direction. He had Emily, and together, they were building something that was worth fighting for. After Mrs. Henderson left, Jack sat down with the book, flipping through the pages. It was a reminder of how far he had come and how much he had learned. But more importantly, it was a reminder that the journey wasn't over. It was just beginning. That night, as Jack and Emily sat down for dinner, Jack couldn't help but reflect on the life they were building. The quiet evenings, the shared laughter, the small moments that made everything feel worthwhile. Emily was growing, and Jack was growing with her. They were both learning what it meant to have a family, to have someone to care for, and to be cared for in return. As they finished their meal, Emily looked up at Jack, her eyes bright. "Do you think we'll ever leave this place?" she asked, her voice full of curiosity. Jack smiled at her, his heart swelling with love. "Maybe one day," he said. "But for now, this is our home. And I'm happy here." Emily smiled, her eyes lighting up. "Me too," she said softly. Jack reached over and took her hand, feeling the warmth of her trust and the quiet strength she had found within herself. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time in his life, Jack knew that they could face whatever came next together. He wasn't alone anymore, and neither was she. They were a team, a family, and that was more than enough. As the evening wore on, and they settled into their quiet routine, Jack found himself looking forward to the days ahead. No matter what the future held, he knew they would face it together, side by side, just like they always had. As time passed, Jack and Emily found themselves more rooted in their quiet life. The house had become a true home, each room a reflection of their shared effort to create something lasting. The garage, once a place where Jack had sought refuge from the world, was now filled with the sounds of their teamwork, tools clinking, laughter echoing, and the hum of progress. Jack had never expected such a transformation in his life, but it was happening slowly, steadily, and it felt right. One morning, As Jack sipped his coffee on the porch, he watched Emily in the garden. She was planting new flowers, her hands gently working the soil. Her smile was bright as she looked up at him, and for a moment, Jack allowed himself to simply take in the scene. The sun was high in the sky, warming the earth and the house, a perfect spring day that seemed to promise endless possibilities. Emily had grown so much since they had first met. She was no longer the scared little girl who had wandered into his life in need of protection. She was strong, confident, and full of hope. Jack felt an overwhelming sense of pride as he watched her. She had come a long way, and so had he. He had found a sense of purpose, a place to belong, and it was with Emily, in this small house, that he had built it. Do you think we should start looking for a bigger house? Emily's voice pulled Jack from his thoughts. He looked up, meeting her gaze as she stood by the garden bed, wiping the sweat from her brow. A bigger house. Jack repeated, a little surprised. Emily nodded, her eyes thoughtful. Well, we've made this place work, but maybe one day we could have a little more room, a bigger yard, somewhere we can grow even more. Jack smiled, setting his coffee down on the porch railing. You know, he said, his voice slow and deliberate. I think that sounds like a good idea. But for now, this is our home, and I'm happy here. Emily smiled back, and Jack could see the contentment in her eyes. They had come so far from the days when the future had seemed uncertain, and now it felt like the world was opening up to them. They didn't need anything extravagant. Their life, though simple, was rich with meaning. And that was enough. Over the following weeks, Jack continued to work on the garage, adding little improvements to make it more functional, more comfortable. He spent evenings with Emily, talking about their future, about the life they were building together. There were no more ghosts of the past, no more looming threats from the club. For the first time in years, Jack felt like he could breathe without the constant pressure of a life he no longer wanted. As summer approached, the days grew longer, and Jack found himself spending more time with Emily outside, helping her with the garden and enjoying the quiet moments they shared. He had learned to appreciate these moments, to savor the peace that came with them. The world outside could be chaotic, but inside their little home, everything felt just as it should be. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, Emily rested her head on Jack's shoulder, her eyes fixed on the stars above. Do you ever think about what would have happened if we hadn't met? She asked softly. Jack's heart tightened at her question. He had thought about it, of course. He had wondered what his life would have been like if he hadn't stopped that day, if he hadn't opened up to her. I don't like to think about that, Jack replied, his voice steady. What matters is that we did meet. And we're here now, building a life together. Emily smiled, her eyes sparkling in the dim light of the porch. I'm glad we met, Jack, she said, her voice filled with warmth. Jack kissed the top of her head, feeling the weight of her words settle into his heart. So am I, Emily. So am I. The days passed, and their life continued to grow in the quiet, steady way that Jack had come to love. He didn't need to chase anything anymore. He didn't need to run from the past or worry about the future. All he needed was right here, with Emily. And that was enough. One afternoon, as Jack worked on a new project in the garage, Emily came to him with a piece of paper in her hands. Jack, I've been thinking, she began, her voice serious. Jack looked up, intrigued. What's on your mind? Emily took a deep breath and handed him the paper. It was a simple drawing, but it was one that Jack hadn't expected. It was a house, but not the one they had now. This one was bigger, with a large garden and a white picket fence. It was a dream, a vision of the future, and Jack felt his heart swell as he looked at it. I know we've talked about it before, Emily said, her voice quiet, but I think it's time. Maybe we should start looking for that bigger house, the one we've always wanted. Jack felt a lump form in his throat as he looked at the drawing. It was more than just a house. It was a symbol of everything they had built together, everything they had fought for. He reached over and took her hand, squeezing it gently. I think that's a great idea, he said, his voice full of emotion. We've earned it, haven't we? Emily smiled, a bright, hopeful smile that lit up her face. Yes, we have, she said. Jack leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the drawing, and for the first time, he felt like the future was wide open. They had come so far, but there was still so much more ahead of them. And together, they could face whatever came next. They were a team, and no matter where the road led, they would always have each other.